Apologies for those that that tuned in, well, not late. I tuned in late, so didn't end up recording this part of the lecture, but so far this has just been review of our motivations from last time. So last time we motivated that, we motivated that you could use ordinal utility for ranking, but that there are advantages to using an absolute score per individual. And so that is a so-called cardinal utility. And if you have such an absolute, you can aggregate them together into a cardinal social welfare function. And that cardinal social welfare function takes advantage of everyone having an absolute scale that allows you to bundle those scales together into a measure of, ta-da, social welfare. And the downsides or upsides or whatever you want to view in this is that the way that you aggregate is really important. And so if you just add everybody's utility up together, that basically says, I don't really care about the distribution. I just want to make sure that overall, if we add everything up together, the society has somewhere in there got a lot of utility. It might be that all of the utility is bundled up with one person and everybody else's life sucks, but I don't really care about that. That to me is the same as everybody's life being mediocre. So, so that is, the downside of using a strict utilitarian or a total utility framework. And so you can come up with other ways to aggregate things. So I mentioned that there are economists who have come up with ways to say, we're going to take per capita income, which is one of these ones where you don't care about the distribution, and we are going to scale that by a measure of the distribution of how equal things are in terms of wealth. And if we make that our social welfare function, then you say, well, what do you mean make that our social welfare function? Well, what I mean is that you can base policy based on that. You can say, how well are we doing? Do we want to be doing better? And you can base that off of these things like these social welfare functions, or you can compare across countries and you can say, what is the social welfare in one country or another? You might find that one country has a higher total or has a higher per capita income, but another country actually has more distributional equality. And so you might say that even though nobody is as rich in that country with a higher distributional equality, they might be somehow doing better. And we want to kind of give them bonus for having this, this more equal distribution. So the way in which you measure things really matters. Now, that's kind of interesting when you compare across countries, but when you start getting down to the nitty-gritty of, well, I need to make economic decisions about pollution and things like that, it kind of is unfortunate that my decisions might be so biased by which social welfare function that I picked. And so basically, the problem here is there's too much subjectivity in the social welfare function choice in many applications to be practical. And so really what I would want is the ability to go back to ranking, to go back to ordinality. Gee, wouldn't it be nice if I could just rank outcomes? Now, and I can ask an individual, how do you rank something? And you just give them two options and say, I like that one better than that one. It's really hard to do that at a social level, but we can at least try. And that's where Pareto efficiency really came into play. So I kind of snuck in Pareto efficiency when I talked about it at an individual level. With my background, we talk about Pareto efficiency in a wide range of contexts. And so for me, when you're talking about an apple versus an orange and you're comparing across multiple objectives, that to me is a question of Pareto ranking. Like if I can manage to get more potassium and more fiber simultaneously, that is a Pareto improvement. Now, a strict economist only talks about Pareto efficiency when it comes to social welfare. So they don't think about goods, in terms of being the objectives that we're optimizing. They think about like my utility and your utility and how we combine them together. And so for an economist, a Pareto improvement is something that's good for us both. And if something is only good for me and it causes you to go down in your utility, that is not a Pareto improvement. And if all that I'm left with are those types of those types of changes where it'll be good for one person at the cost of someone else, then we're Pareto optimal. And so this, and I'll write that stuff down here, but this idea of Pareto efficiency helps us restore a level of objectivity. So we've got lots of people's utility functions, and we can now combine them in a way where we can say, basically, we want to get rid of outcomes that we know are bad for everybody and only be left with hard choices where we know they're hard choices. We don't want to be stuck with a choice that we don't want to find ourselves setting a emissions control policy in a way that it would have been better for everyone if we would have shifted it. Like if there was a way for us to increase a tax that actually makes everyone do better, then we should increase that tax or decrease a tax. If there's a way for us to reduce taxes and manage to also reduce pollution, we should do that. And that's what Pareto efficiency tries to find, is like, it tries to get rid of all of those things that we should definitely do, so that our choices are left with the hard choices that we can debate about. And so we want to get rid of the undebatable ones. So that's basically that's what we're going to be talking about today. And then how does Pareto efficiency translate to the supply and demand curves that we have been seeing pop up in the book and relate to the marginal benefit curves that we started to talk about in the last unit. All right, so this solution here, our proposed solution, is Pareto efficiency. Good, and then the screen share continues to work, which is good. All right, so how might I depict Pareto efficiency? So the idea here is that in the notes that I'm writing, I will post as well. So the notes that I'm reading from, which are my pre-lecture notes, are already online. You can view those as you like. And the notes that I'm writing, I'll post after the lecture in the captured video section, along with the videos and such. All right, so the idea is if I have like 4 individuals, so I've got this pie here, and I've got these 4 individuals, so let's say, right, okay, that's fine. And so this is, you can view, the idea here is this is kind of like the utility of the society. And this is the utility of an individual A in the society. And this is the utility of individual B in the society, and so on. So when you add those all up together, as if our social welfare function was a total utility function, a strict utilitarian function, then this is kind of how everybody's utility compares to each other. They all are, they're all adding up to this pie here. And so what we would like to seek out when we seek for Pareto improvements is a way to make the pie bigger in such a way that no individual's absolute amount allocated to them changes for the worse. So we can make the pie bigger in ways where the relative value of each individual's contribution to the pie changes. But we want to make sure that after the change, they still feel like they had as much as they did before the change. So you can imagine that one way to do that, if I were to say, okay, so one way to do that is I can just take my exact same pie here, and I can just scale it up. So I can take this guy and just make it bigger. And so that is one way to do that. And so here, clearly, everyone benefits and I can just scale up. And that is one Pareto improvement. So it's Pareto improvement because everybody, the proportion stayed the same, but everybody improved based on what they were doing before. But there are lots of other different Pareto improvements that I could also have done. So I could have made a change in society. Again, change in society might be I adjust a tax policy. I adjust a cap for a cap and trade. There's all sorts of different things. I pave roads. You know, all of these different things are going to benefit people differently. And we are hoping to do things that make it so that although one group might benefit more than another, all groups feel like they have at least not lost any ground. That's what a Pareto improvement is. So, you know, an alternative way we could do that, I could have instead, you know, changed this pi so that the pi has gotten a little bigger than it was before. Maybe I'll make it even bigger to just kind of make it more exaggerated. So pi has definitely gotten bigger, but maybe now A and sorry that these are not like, you know, going through the center of the pi, B and C really didn't get much more out of the growth. But D had a huge amount of growth. And so here, you know, no one is worse, and D is a lot better. And so these are two examples of Pareto improvements. And so what we're trying to prevent is, so, you know, the goal here is to prevent changes that cause any group from doing worse after. So we're just trying to basically say, what are all the ways that everyone could not do worse after? So we're trying to, the whole point of Pareto improvements is that we're trying to find a space where we are finally at a space where there's no other way that we can make it better for everybody. That if we make any changes from this space, we necessarily are going to have to trade off between one person and another. Okay, so that's Pareto efficiency, Pareto improvement. Now notice here that there is, this approach has no pressure for distributional equality. So we still have some of the same problems that we had in our social welfare case for like total utility, is that Pareto improvements don't have any angle that sort of causes one to be, you know, more than another. So, but what we hopefully can do is find a group of solutions that are Pareto efficient, and then choose among that group of solutions according to other criteria, which may be more sensitive to distributional factors. All right, so far, does this make sense? Are there questions about Pareto efficiency, or what the goal is here? Is that we would like to find, you know, that if I were to highlight, we are trying to find these. So, you know, we're trying to discover these options, and we want to prevent any other options. Okay. Now, a big question here is Pareto efficiency practical? Are Pareto improvements something that we actually can seek out in the real world? Anybody sort of just thinking about that, does anybody see a problem with saying that I am only going to pursue policy changes that are going to be good for everyone, or at least not hurt someone? But I am only willing to make a policy change that, or in other words, to say that is, I am unwilling to make any policy changes that cause a group to do poorly. Does anyone see a problem with that? Why would that be impractical?
So I see a couple potential problems. One of them would be funding. It would be really expensive to make sure that everybody is benefiting. Another potential problem I see is scarcity of resources. And so if there's a limited amount of water in a country, there's not a good way to expand the water. So everybody benefits.
So like in that case, from just kind of a natural resources standpoint, we're saying that in order for everyone to be better, it's probably going to be very costly in terms of dollars or in terms of actual natural resources. And if we expand our view of social welfare to include intertemporal social welfare, another way to say that is benefiting everyone today is going to cause a cost to people in the future. So that's one way. It's sort of impractical to say everyone today can do better, and because effectively what you're saying is making a Pareto movement a narrow-minded, a nearsighted Pareto movement is probably not a Pareto improvement, because you're probably screwing over someone later on. And so if we consider all of the society, even discounted society, because we don't really care that much about people in the future, but we care about them a little bit, then we're saying that we're probably going to take away from them. So that's one thing. And I guess a simpler way to say that is there are very, very, very few ways that you can make a change at the level of a society that isn't going to hurt somebody. I mean, the reason people get into politics is because their constituencies are probably not going to benefit from changes that another constituency suggests. So one constituency says, that they want, particularly want a particular area of the world to be conserved, or they would like there to be more access to healthcare or whatever, and that sort of thing. And that sounds good when you just think about that group of people, but you have to realize that in order to pay for those things, you're probably going to have to raise taxes on another group of people, and that other group of people may not feel that they benefit from those services. And so it ends up making it sound like, well, okay, so that means that we can't ever provide healthcare to people, because providing healthcare to some group, which would make it better for them, is going to make it worse for another group who has to pay more taxes to pay for that, access to healthcare. So it seems kind of impractical. What economists did is they said, well, we like the idea of Pareto efficiency. It feels like there's something there. It's really nice that we can basically say, we put 1 million people in a room and we recognize that they all have different utility, and some people are going to benefit more than others from different things. And we really just want to get rid of all the things that are bad for everybody. I mean, that's really the thing with Pareto efficiency. It's not that we want to make it, it's not that we want to exclude things that are bad for a small number of people. We want to exclude things that are bad for a large number of people. So we kind of want to make sure we're growing the pie. Like really the thing about Pareto efficiency, the spirit of Pareto efficiency, is you don't just want to say that we are going to grow pie piece D while we're shrinking pieces A, B, and C. Like, that's the thing, is we kind of just want to make sure that things are kind of staying growing. And so we're okay with some people doing worse off, just so long as other people are doing significantly better off. So it kind of makes it's almost like you want to embed a cost benefit analysis into it. And so these other economists sort of came up with a way to make Pareto efficiency more practical. And this is something that your book talks about. And those are, I'll call this Kaldor-Hicks efficiency or improvements. And these are also known as potential Pareto improvements. And so how does that work? So in the Kaldor-Hicks model, you have what we're going to call Kaldor-Hicks compensation. So before I go on, for anyone who's read this ahead in the book, does somebody want to give me their summary of how they read what a Kaldor-Hicks improvement is, or what's the difference between Kaldor-Hicks and Pareto? Does anybody have a good summary for that? Anybody? I can wait. Or does anybody remember what this compensation is about? It's true that this can leave, Kaldor-Hicks compensation opens up the possibility that we can make changes in society that will leave some people off worse.
So is
but
this
it only allows that. Go ahead.
Is this the thing
Go ahead.
where it can leave some people worse, like Jeremy said in the chat, if the people who benefit have the ability to compensate those people, even though they're not required to do so?
Yes, that is exactly right. That's what Kaldor-Hicks compensation is. It's well said. So to repeat that, and we'll write this down too, is that we're looking for so-called potential Pareto improvements, where we assert that side deals are possible in theory. And so the idea here, they don't actually have to happen, but the idea here is that a Kaldor-Hicks improvement, so a KH improvement, is one where so you can get there decreases in the utility of some groups can potentially be compensated for by increases in other groups and after compensation, the society has improved in the Pareto sense. So in this case, as said in the chat, and then said over the audio there, is that you actually can allow people to do worse off, but the people that are doing better are going to do so much better that they'll take some of the extra utility that they've just gained and give it to the people who are worse off. And the people who did better will still be better than they were before, but the people who did worse off will at least break even on the deal. After getting paid by that, they'll be doing as well as they did before. If there are that amount of gains in the group that does better, enough to compensate the group that does worse, then the Kaldor-Hicks model suggests that we're actually have made an improvement that's in the sense of Pareto. Now, you don't actually have to make that compensation. You can. So this has happened. So like there's, you know, an example, and I'm pretty sure this comes out of your book, but you know, one example is from like in 1993, there was you know, a Northwest forest plan. And in this case, they wanted to make a reduction in the allowable amount of timber harvest in order to protect endangered owl. So we had here an endangered owl. And so we need to reduce timber harvest. People need to stop cutting down trees. And so they protect a bunch of timber harvest. And then there's a question, so I'll get to it. So the question that the other may get compensated. So there's a question in the chat. So one does a whole lot better and then the other gets compensated later on. The other could get compensated later on, but they don't have to. A Kaldor-Hicks improvement means that there was enough utility gain that in principle, the one who lost out could get compensated later on, but they don't actually have to get compensated later on. That's kind of like the kicker there. So in the real case, so in this Northwest forest plan, they wanted to protect this forest for this owl, but in doing so, it was going to really hurt the timber industry because the timber industry is going to lose jobs because they had less ability for this timber. So what they did is they said, okay, fine. What we'll do is we will raise tax revenue so that we can compensate the timber industry with money for retaining jobs and rural development and direct payments, so that hopefully then the timber industry will not be any worse off. And so it's a little bit like a subsidy, but it's in this timber case. So it's almost like paying the timber industry not to cut timber, and so hopefully after that, then the society as a whole is better off, because those that benefited from having the owl receive that benefit, and those that benefited from not having the owl receive payments from those that benefit from having the owl, and those payments end up making them as good as they were before. And so that would suggest that protecting the forest because it was possible to do that, then protecting the forest was a Kaldor-Hicks improvement. Now, the kicker, again, as I mentioned, you know, in response to the chat, is that actual compensation for the timber industry didn't have to happen. It would still be a Kaldor-Hicks improvement. Just the fact that it could happen, just the fact that people were willing to pay the extra tax that would generate enough revenue. Like, you can put it on, you can ask people to vote on it. How much are you willing to pay in taxes to make sure we protect this owl? And people say, I'll pay, you know, another, you know, whatever they do for real estate tax, it might be another certain amount per square acre or whatever, but they're willing to pay for the owl. The fact that people would be willing to pay for that owl and the amount of revenue that would be generated could pay for the timber industry suggests that it is a Kaldor-Hicks improvement to protect the owl. But you don't actually have to raise the revenue, and you don't actually have to pay the timber industry. A Kaldor-Hicks improvement just says there is enough benefit generated that we are willing to let the timber industry flounder, because losing the timber industry is somehow less bad than the gains we get at protecting the owl. So sometimes you have the transfers and sometimes you don't, but you don't need them. A Kaldor-Hicks improvement does not say the transfers have to happen. They only have to say the transfers could happen. Are there questions about that?
What's the purpose of adding that caveat of saying it doesn't actually have to happen? It just doesn't seem to mesh with like economic theory of like rationality. Like, if you don't have to make the compensation, why would you in like a capitalist market economy?
Well, so the idea here is we're trying to say, how do we come up with a notion of social welfare that that identifies things that we are saying are objectively better for society? And so the idea here is that if one group has benefited enough that they in potential could compensate another group for their losses, then we view as a whole, the society has done better if we're buying into this Kaldor-Hicks criteria. So the Kaldor-Hicks criteria is, how do we define that we've done something that has made society better? And Kaldor-Hicks say, like, really what we're saying is, we know that we need to allow some groups to benefit and some groups to lose, but we don't know how much loss we're willing to tolerate. And Kaldor-Hicks says we will tolerate loss as long as the benefits generated are large enough that they potentially could compensate the people who've lost. In the owl example, it's very clear who's benefiting and who's losing. So in that example, it's easy to actually say, you know, levy a tax and pay them. Now, at the instant you do that side deal, it's not a potential Pareto improvement, it's a Pareto improvement. If you actually implement that tax, then people are doing better in the true sense of Pareto. But a Kaldor-Hicks improvement says that even if you don't levy the tax, then you still can say you're better off. Now, in other cases, it might be the groups that are doing worse off are hard to find. It would be impossible to sort of, you know, like the timber industry is easy. You could say, okay, I know that you work for the timber industry, so I can compensate you directly. But it might be that, you know, a scattering of people in Ohio, a scattering of people in Maine, a scattering of people in Arizona are doing worse off due to some policy change. But it's hard to like figure out how to group them into one group and then send them all direct payments. So even if we could take all of the benefit and put it into dollars and send it out, we might not even know who to exactly compensate without some complicated sense there. But Kaldor-Hicks would still suggest that as long as we estimate that the losses that we're making across the entire nation are going to be counterbalanced by the benefits that we're making across the entire nation, then we should feel free to make that improvement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Any other questions about that?
If possible, could you type that wording you used, that we will tolerate loss as long as et cetera, just so I can, that was good wording.
Yeah, so, okay, I'll try to do that. So in the Kaldor-Hicks perspective, you know, it's, we will tolerate large scale societal losses so long as they are counterbalanced by large scale societal gains.
Thank you so much.
Sure. And it's a bit of a Rorschach test when you read this. Like, some of you are going to read that and you're going to look at me and say, oh, this guy's a filthy laissez-faire capitalist. And he says, as long as a 1%er gets a huge, you know, increase in their, you know, and I don't know, tax refunds, that it's going to counterbalance all the losses that people get from, you know, not having access to education or something like that. That might be one way you view it, or you view it the other way around, where you can say that we can take a huge amount of revenue away from the 1%ers, and we're willing to tolerate screwing over the 1%ers just so long as we increase the benefit to educational systems in such that so many more people benefit that we're willing to tolerate the losses to the 1%ers. So the way you interpret this kind of depends on your perspective.
Okay.
Was there a question? I think I heard a microphone.
No, I was just saying that's a good way to think about it. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so that's the Kaldor-Hicks perspective. It allows for differentiating between options that do not benefit all, and so you know, so again, both Kaldor-Hicks and Pareto. So I guess in both cases, a Kaldor-Hicks is a more practical Pareto, and in both cases, the goal is to eliminate, we'll say, large-scale societal changes that generally lead to harm when aggregating across society. And when you look at it that way, then really it sounds like Kaldor-Hicks improvement is just a way of thinking in like total utility again. Like it really sounds like a very strict utilitarian way of thinking of things. But so really it's almost like Kaldor-Hicks efficiency provides a little bit more flexibility than the cardinal social welfare approach of just saying total utility. But still the spirit feels very total utility-like. It's not putting any emphasis on distributional equality or anything like that. But what I really like about the Pareto or Kaldor-Hicks perspective is that you don't come out of it necessarily with a single solution. So if I want to maximize cardinal social welfare, there's like one option that maximizes the total utility, or well, I don't want to say there's one option, but the focus is not on the Pareto efficient set of things. The focus with Kaldor-Hicks and Pareto is this, is this so-called, Pareto efficient. It's a set of options where there are no Kaldor-Hicks improvements possible. That's kind of the outcome that we want. This is like, find this set. And so these are like all of the tax policies for which there'd be the only way, if you were to shift away from these tax policies, you would be guaranteed to be doing net societal harm. Moving along these tax policies is going to effectively redistribute wealth along society, but you wouldn't be, at that point, it's kind of like if there was a tax policy you could make that makes everybody better and you didn't take it, then you'd be called an idiot. Like everyone would do better if you made that change in the tax policy, everyone, regardless of how you rank everyone's single utility, regardless if they're a tree hugger or they're a gas guzzler. If both of those groups would do better with your change in tax policy, you need to change that tax policy, you need to make it. And what the Kaldor-Hicks set here, or the Pareto efficient set says, is it basically means that anything inside that set is going to require a trade-off between groups. So it is something that everybody is free to argue about. And you're not going to be arguing about dumb things that are going to be doing better for everybody. So we want to find all of the things that we want to exclude all of the options that are objectively worse, and then so that we're left with a set of things that are subjectively able to sort of balance. Like you can only make the choice at this point using subjective criteria. That's the whole point of this ordinal platform in a social welfare sense. All right, so that's kind of where we're going with that. And so we now need to sort of frame this. We've taken this abstract idea and we need to put this into the quantitative market frameworks that we started to build on when we talked about market or net benefit, marginal benefit, and then moving into supply and demand as you started to read in your book. All right, so let's start to move towards making this related to all this marginal benefit stuff in the algebra and all those sorts of things. All right, so in chapter 4, we started, the focus is market efficiency. And you hear this term efficiency, and efficiency in this sense is, in an economic sense, is Pareto or Kaldor-Hicks efficiency. And so arriving at a market equilibrium that is efficient means that you are inside that Pareto efficient set, where if you were to shift outside of that efficient equilibrium to something that's inefficient, then there would be an option that the market would benefit everyone in the market to go back into the set. And so that's what we're sort of looking for, is that what are ways in which we can intervene in markets to make sure that the market comes to equilibrium inside one of these efficient sets where everyone is sort of objectively better than they would be if they were outside of the set. And so that'll become more clear as we move into chapter 5, exactly what I mean when we talk about market failures, which is, I think, the next lecture and maybe the end of this lecture, depending on how the timing goes. And so what do we mean by a market? So a market is a decentralized collection. I'm going to emphasize decentralized collection of buyers and sellers. If you like, you can think of them as consumers and producers, whose interactions emphasizing interactions determine the allocation of goods through exchange. All right, so the idea behind a market-based approach is that, so you could have a centralized, like a command and control approach, you know, like a China or something like that, where you go in and you say, apples are this price, and we're going to just force them to be that price. And if you make apples that price, people who can afford that price will buy apples, and people who can't afford that won't. So from a centralized perspective, setting prices is effectively setting the allocation of goods to those who can afford it and those who can't afford it. And so that's the power of price setting, is you're not just setting prices, you're setting the allocation of goods. And so when we talk about Pareto efficiency, we need to say, is this the most efficient allocation of goods? Are all the people who have apples the right people to have apples? Like, if I were to change the price a little bit, more people will be able to get to buy apples. And will that end up making society better off for those people to have apples? Because those people now, those people will now be healthier. And maybe if they're healthier, then they'll be able to participate in other interactions. It might benefit other people who could afford the apples, you know. So that's kind of what we mean about the allocations of goods. And a market is one where you don't set the prices ahead of time. You allow people to trade goods. And so you can, somebody can say, here's an apple. It cost me it cost me 10 cents to harvest this apple. Are you willing to buy it for $1? If you'll buy it for $1, I'm willing to sell it for you, that because it only cost me 10 cents. And you say to you, man, when I eat an apple, that makes me so full that I don't have to eat a different amount of lunch. And so I get $2 of benefit out of that apple. So my $2 of benefit is worth the $1 you're asking me to pay for it. And so I'm willing to pay your $1. And so gradually over time, as more people start selling apples, then competitors come in and they say, well, he charged you $1. Well, I'm going to charge you 50 cents because, again, it only cost me 10 cents to harvest the apple. So my 50 cents is still good for me, and it sounds like it's even better for you. And so the prices naturally shift around, and then they end up coming to an equilibrium. And that equilibrium ends up also coming to an equilibrium distribution of apples. So naturally, markets change how things are allocated as they evolve, and then you come to an equilibrium of these apples. And so how does all that stuff work? And so again, we call our sellers, we're going to refer to them as consumers, as producers. And we've got our buyers as consumers. Those are just the words that are common for us to use. And so, what is market efficiency in this framework? And so, market efficiency is an equilibrium outcome that maximizes benefits to producers and consumers in the, I'm going to say Pareto and, more practically Kaldor-Hicks, but in the Pareto sense. And so basically you can imagine I have a utility function for producers and I have a utility function for consumers. And I am trying to maximize social welfare across producers and consumers. So I am trying to allow them to interact in a way where when things come to equilibrium at a particular price and a particular number of apples and cars and everything else that are sold, then those things that are that when things settle out, then if I look at the utility imparted to producers and utility imparted to consumers, then there's not going to be a change that would make everyone better off in the kind of Pareto or Kaldor-Hicks sense, that I'm going to be actually at an efficient equilibrium. So efficient means no Pareto improvements. That's what Pareto efficiency means. And we'll see more quantitatively what we mean by that as we go on here. All right, so we've already talked a little bit about things like the demand curve. And so the demand curve is the consumer willingness to pay. So that's, you should keep them on WTP, is willingness to pay for the next unit, marginal unit of good exchanged on the market. And so a demand curve is, you're often going to have something where you've got Q, these are, goods exchanged on the market, and you'll have dollar per unit of those goods, and you've got some demand curve, which, we often will draw like a line, but it doesn't have to be a line. And this just indicates that people are willing to pay the most when the good is scarce, and they are willing to pay. So this is the pay most when good is scarce, and pay least when good is highly available. And so it's the producers that determine how much good is available in the market. And if they flood the market with the good, then the good loses value. And so the next marginal unit, so the next exchange of good, will end up being for pennies. And so they'll have to pull things away from the market in order to raise the price. And so so these are, again, prices. These are potential prices. And so this here is our demand curve. Now, if we are in an efficient market, then the demand is equal to the marginal benefit. And so what do I mean by that? What I'm saying here is that let's say, for example, National Public Radio. National Public Radio is a great example of something that is not, it does not, donations to National Public Radio do not aren't exchanged in an efficient market. What I mean by that is anyone can turn on National Public Radio, and you might not get any benefit from it. You might think that's boring. I hate National Public Radio. But there are some of you out there who probably do, every morning, turn on National Public Radio and listen to it. There are a lot more people that listen to National Public Radio than pay for it. So there are a bunch of people who are not willing to pay for National Public Radio, but they receive benefit from it. So that's an example where even though quantity is being supplied on the market, there are a bunch of people out there who can get away with consuming National Public Radio without paying anything for it. So you have like a demand curve for those people that is not related to the actual benefit that they're getting from the stuff that's being supplied out there. And so that's an example of the inefficient market. And so if we were to make National Public Radio efficient, then there would be a way that when you turn on your radio, you'd almost have to pay to hear National Public Radio, and the amount you paid would depend upon how much you hear. And so on commercial radio, that's more of an efficient market, because although you get a benefit from hearing commercial radio, you also have to hear commercials, and someone is paid for those commercials. And so that's why commercial radio is an efficient market. And and then another great example in the chat. So the two examples here. Wikipedia is like the public radio market. Thank you, excellent example. Wikipedia is a great example. You benefit from it even though you're not donating or maybe not editing. Sirius XM radio is you actually do pay for every minute that you listen. You stop paying, you stop getting the benefit. So they can tightly control who gets access to that benefit, which means they don't need you to hear as many commercials. So that's what we mean by demand is equal to benefit. That is the case for Sirius XM radio. They can actually create it so that your willingness to pay is tied to the benefit you get from the radio. But in public radio, they can't do that. So that's why public radio is inefficient. Another great example, tap water in the US, that is an interesting case because tap water, we do pay for it, but we probably don't pay enough. So we probably get more benefit out than we end up paying for it. And so that's an example where I think that's another one where you could claim that the water market is not actually efficient because we are able to pay for far more, we're able to pay and get far more benefit than we're paying in. All right, so that's the demand curve. The other curve that we worry about in markets is the other half of it, the supply curve. Thank you for those examples. Those are excellent examples in the chat. Please, those are, always volunteer that stuff. That's great. You're far more creative than I. You will hear me say public radio over and over and over again. And so thanks for that. So supply curve, and that's the flip side of that. So the supply curve is a producer's willingness to accept. Again, WTA, you just got to get used to that. Willingness to accept versus willingness to pay. Willingness to accept a price for the next marginal unit of a good, given a certain amount of goods already exchanged, or let's say already being produced. And so this is an example where again, quantity that are on the market, and then this is the price that they're willing to accept for that. And generally, if no goods are on the market, their willingness to accept is they'll take anything. So for the first marginal unit, But as more things get produced on the market, then they will start asking for more. And so you've got, whereas your demand curve slopes in this direction, your supply curve is going to go in this direction. And so the supply curve is going to be move off in this direction. So this is our supply. And this relates to the costs of production. And generally, the marginal costs of production get larger as you produce more. And so in an efficient market, supply is equal to marginal cost. So in the efficient market, if I pollute the air, then I not only pay the cost of generating the pollution, but I also pay the cost that goes into the air. But we all know that doesn't happen, right? So if you're free to pollute the air, someone else is paying that cost. And so your marginal cost is lower than the total marginal cost to society. So this marginal cost, you could view this as a marginal cost to society. And likewise, if I were to flip back, this marginal benefit, you could view this as a marginal benefit to society. And in an efficient market, demand is equal to marginal benefit to society. In an efficient market, supply is equal to marginal cost to society. But there are tons of markets, again, like in the case of emissions, where these two things are not equal. So if you can emit only paying the cost of like the electricity you needed to generate, to run the machines, to generate the emissions, but your emissions are putting a cost on someone else that you're not paying, then your supply curve is going to be under the marginal cost curve for society. So the society's marginal cost curve will be greater than your supply curve. And so that would be an inefficient result. So, but in the efficient market, these two things match. So in the efficient market, then marginal benefits equal marginal costs where supply equals demand. So if I were to sort of draw those curves together, then if I were to draw a supply curve, I'll just keep it linear. And a demand curve, keep it linear. And if I were to draw a supply curve, again, linear. So I'll write this just as a reminder. This is our supply. This down here is our demand. And this here, dollars per Q. This is the price of the good. And this is the amount of good allocated to the market. If I were to set a price down here, let's just say I'm going to force the price to be this one, I'll call it P1. Then that P1 tells me that at this low price of P1, that the suppliers are unwilling to supply any more than this quantity, Q1. But people buying the product would love to buy more than Q1. People buying the product, this is what the consumers would want, this much. But the producers only produce this much. And so at this particular price, then this is the amount that's produced, which means that the consumers are left feeling a marginal benefit that is way up here. So this is, and again, assuming efficiency, assuming we've got all the conditions, assuming efficient market conditions, and I'll say what those efficient market conditions are, if not today, starting next lecture. So assuming efficient market conditions, this is what, this is the willingness to pay will be far above the actual price. And so the producer surplus down here, we call this the producer surplus, this triangle down here, producer surplus. This is the net benefit to producers. So, and this is, or otherwise known as the producer surplus, which is the benefit that they get from selling the good at price P1 over and above the cost it takes for them to make or produce each marginal unit of that good. That's what the producer surplus is. This is basically the utility of the producer group. And you can view that as utility sub P. So that's how much utility is in the producer group. Now we can then also measure the consumer surplus, which is this top end here, which we've already had some experience with. And so the consumer surplus, we can view that as so consumer surplus is the net benefit to consumer for good over and above cost, which is the price of the good. And so that is the utility of the consumer. And so the net benefit to society, so the net benefit to society of this particular price level is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, which is kind of that area of that sort of trapezoid looking thing. So if I were to kind of highlight a little bit of this, it's kind of a model of what I've got over there. That trapezoid is the net benefit to society, which is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus together. And so if we look at that, when we can say, wow, we can increase both of those. So it would be a Pareto improvement to move the price closer to the willingness to pay. Because if we move that price closer to the willingness to pay, then our producer surplus is going to increase as that triangle increases, and the consumer surplus is also going to increase. And so we can gradually fill out this, this region here. So this region that I have, that's in between here, which I guess I could highlight in, I don't know, orange or something. This region is lost opportunity. And we refer to that region of lost opportunity as so-called dead weight loss. And so if a central government was to come and say, we're going to set the price at P1, and then you start noticing there's queues of people who want to buy things at that low price and they can't produce, but the producers aren't willing to produce more of it. And so we would say to that central government, that is an inefficient result. You are causing your society dead weight loss because you will not allow the price to be raised. if you allowed the price to be raised, producers would produce more of it, and overall, more people would get access to that good. But you have made the price so low that producers are unwilling to produce a lot of that good. So it is an inefficient allocation of that good, that even though the price is low, the amount being produced is also low, and you're doing damage to the society. How much damage? You can measure that by the area of that triangle, the area of that orange triangle. That area is the damage to society, the so-called deadweight loss. All right. So I hope you can see that ideally where we would like to be is at this point in the center here. That magic point there, which I can shift to the next page here. So again, I've got my quantity, my dollars per quantity. I've got my demand curve. I've got my supply curve. So that's supply, whoa. That's supply, that's demand. And assuming efficient market conditions, then this magic point right in the middle here, this is the efficient so this is the efficient price, or I can even say the socially efficient price and quantity. And I've just again denoted them as P star and Q star. And so the fact that supply is equal to demand means that we have reached a market equilibrium. And the fact that marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost means that we have reached a socially efficient outcome. So you need both of these things together for you to have a socially efficient or an efficient market outcome. And so, so in other words, supply and demand, if you let a market run, so you aren't a central government, you let it run, then you're always going to come to equilibrium where supply is equal to demand. But if supply is not equal to marginal benefit, I'm sorry, if supply is not equal to marginal cost and demand is not equal to marginal benefit, then that equilibrium won't be socially efficient, because you need to come to equilibrium at a point where you have this socially efficient outcome. And so what we end up doing when we intervene in markets is we use instruments like taxes, for example. And if you artificially raise the cost of production of something, then it shifts a supply curve so that the actual supply curve will now incorporate missed costs. And then that will mean that the new supply curve will come to equilibrium in the market at a new place that hopefully now is socially efficient. And that's what we would talk about exactly how we do next time in the next lecture. So I want to end this lecture with, just as a preview of that, to say that that what we're going to start with next time is the efficient market conditions. And and we're basically, you know, I'm just going to write them here: competitive market and information symmetry. And I'll explain all of these in detail. I'll write them out next time. And then complete market. And so basically we're going to talk about these three conditions next time that capture this, oh, right, and then Moksha needs to say, and then captures this, the conditions we need to guarantee that supply equals marginal cost and demand is marginal benefit. But before I give you the attendance question, Moksha wanted to unmute here and mention about her office hours and study sessions. So go ahead, Moksha, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, so I've finally moved to US, so I was like I'll just get a sense of what office hours would be convenient for all of you. So I'll be adding a Google form link on the Canvas page at some point today or tomorrow, so that it'd be great if you guys could just take a look and mark out times which will be convenient for you. And additionally, I was thinking of running a couple of study group sessions for topics that you guys might have issues with. So I'll also keep a small space in the form where you can add possible things that you're having an issue with. So we could probably like get a group together of people who have a similar problem area, and then we could all have a session for that. So I will add it onto the Canvas sheet, and it'll be under the announcements. So yeah, I hope to hear from most of you.
Great, thanks, Moshta. And all right, so that's all we have today. So let me give you an attendance question. So look at that. Attendance exercise, same slide as before. I'll put that in the chat. And my question for you is if a market is efficient, then what is true about the supply curve? So in an efficient market, what is true about the supply curve that isn't always true? So like in the case of emissions, this is not, in the case of pollution, unregulated pollution, in that case, it would not be true. But if you add regulation, we hopefully make it true. So what do we need to be true for a supply curve to be an efficient market? Otherwise, that's all I have for you today. So if you have any questions, lingering questions you'd like, I'm happy to stick around for a while. Otherwise, I'll see you next time on Tuesday.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Yep, you have a good weekend as well.
Hi, I got a question regarding the homework assignment. It's
Yes.
next week, right? So we have what we need. We just need to know about the contents of the book for chapter 4 and 5 to do the homework. That's it.
Yeah. So the most recent homework, so most of that homework is on the social welfare stuff that we covered on Tuesday, and the rest of it is actually covered in chapter 5. We will go over that next lecture. So you should, by the end of next lecture, you'll definitely have enough knowledge. But if you read ahead in chapter 5, you should be able to do it as well.
Okay, just making sure. All right.
Okay. All right. We'll see everybody later.